Hey everybody, welcome to Microbiology. I'm Mary Annarello, your host, and we are finishing up this semester. This is very exciting. Now, in one of the Zooms, I actually talked about something that I want to make sure that everybody gets, because I know not everybody was there and I didn't record the Zoom. So here we go. We're going to chit-chat a little bit about Koch's postulates. Now remember that Koch or Koch, however you pronounce his name, developed a set of criteria that have to be met in order to say that a particular disorder is caused by a particular microbe. And so I wanted to use the example of stomach ulcers. And those of you who have already heard of this can go ahead and just scroll past this or fast forward through this. Stomach ulcers. So basically an open sore on your stomach lining. People used to think, the medical community used to think the only cause of it that we knew of at the time was just stress. And so people with stomach ulcers were told, you're just not handling your stress well. You need to reduce your stress levels. In other words, it's your fault that you have this stomach ulcer. Well, stress certainly does affect human health. Okay, there were a couple of researchers in Australia, and the guy's name is Barry Marshall. And Robin Warren. I had to look up their names. So it's this guy that I'm going to be talking about. They suspected that stomach ulcers, that people with stomach ulcers, it wasn't just because they were stressed or didn't do yoga or whatnot, but it was rather an infection caused by a microbe. So they took Koch's postulates to heart and said, okay, well, they have to be found in every bit of the disease, and you have to isolate the microbe from the diseased tissue. So they took some patients who had stomach ulcers, sad patient with a stomach ulcer, and they did isolate a microbe from their stomach ulcer. Now, the third one is that this pathogen needs to cause disease in a healthy person, and whoa, you cannot do that. You are not going to get FDA approval for that. It's just not moral. The guy, Barry Marshall, decided, okay, you know what? I'm not going to get FDA approval for this at all, so I'm going to drink this myself. So he ingested a culture that he had isolated from this patient's stomach ulcer, and it gave him a stomach ulcer. We turn to that frown down. There we go. He's got a frown now. He had a stomach ulcer, and then they managed to isolate it from that diseased tissue. He did develop an ulcer, and back in the lab, they were able to do a biopsy of his own tissue and isolate the microbe, which is called Helicobacter pylori, or just H. pylori as it's known. And it's something like, I actually did look this up, about 90% of stomach ulcers are caused by an H. pylori infection. Now, what's interesting about H. pylori is that it is found in the stomachs and in the lower GI, the duodenum, of healthy patients. Like, there are people who have H. pylori as a part of their flora, and they don't get sick. So that's a mystery. We don't know. But for about 80% of stomach ulcers that are caused by H. pylori infections, antibiotics will treat them. The remaining 10% of stomach ulcer patients that don't respond to antibiotic treatment, something else is causing their stomach ulcer. But so this guy famously followed Koch's postulates. So I did want to be able to talk about that with you. Okay, so let's go back to, Koch's postulate. So must be present in all cases of the disease. They have since managed to find many, many more patients who stomach ulcers did test positive for H. pylori. Yes, we can isolate it from the disease tissue, and yes, in his case, it did cause disease in a healthy patient, although you can't do that with anybody else but yourself. I will add that Marshall had a lot of data supporting the fact that H. pylori would cause only a stomach ulcer and not, cause other problems for him. So, yes, that was a huge risk that he was willing to take for himself. But he didn't do it very haphazardly. He had a really good idea of what he was doing. And yes, it made him sick. And there you go. The rest is history. All right, so I just wanted to skip back there. Before we get into this is chapter 21, actually. So this is incorrect. So just let me write on this. Quick screenshot. Chapter 21. 21 and done, which is all about epidemiology, which we already know a good bit about, but we need to just go over some of this again and be able to and add to it, because there are some things that we have not talked about with epidemiology. I recently read an article in the New York Times about how, what 700 epidemiologists say they would do now or won't be different after the vaccine and blah, blah, blah. I don't know. They sent out a questionnaire to 2,000 epidemiologists, and 700 of them got back to them, and this was an article that was talking about this. And one of the questions was, what's going to be the same? What will go back to being normal? After the vaccine, and how long will it take? And the final question that they asked them in this questionnaire and that they covered in the article was, what is something that will never be the same, even after, for you personally? What are you never going to do again, even after the vaccine? Is there anything like that? And one epidemiologist said, I will never again have to explain what an epidemiologist is. And I just laughed my head off, because this is stuff we're talking about all the time. Epidemiology, yes, the study of factors that influence transmission, frequency, and distribution of the disease. And an epidemiologist is a person who studies the factors that influence the transmission, frequency, and distribution of a disease. It's who gets a disease, what's causing it, how are they catching it, where are they catching it. So we all know what an epidemiologist does now. And the first epidemiologist was Semmelweis. And I had already told you the story about Semmelweis, who he was. And he's the hand-washing dude from, I think that was in Austria, Vienna. So y'all know what an epidemiologist is. We know what epidemiology is. So let's talk about a few terms that they like. So terms that epidemiologists like: communicable diseases versus non-communicable diseases. This means, are they contagious or not? So let's see. Communicable versus non-communicable. Non-communicable means not contagious. Communicable means contagious. You can pass it from person to person. So, COVID is contagious. The flu is contagious. The mumps, measles, contagious. HIV, contagious. You gotta work at getting an HIV infection. Sexual contact is very personal. That is not casual contact. But you're not going to catch an HIV infection from just, breathing the same air as someone with an HIV infection. It's contagious, but in different ways. And we will talk about different ways that diseases can be communicated. But non-communicable disease, these are not contagious diseases. Diseases you can't catch from someone, like you don't catch cancer from someone. It is okay to breathe the same air as someone with diabetes. You are not going to catch diabetes from another person. It is non-communicable. So things like diabetes, cancer, and the like. we talk about things called reservoirs of infection. This means where does the pathogen hang out? So you would have a human reservoir, for example, for COVID. You can have non-human reservoirs for things like Lyme disease, okay, because it's transmitted by a deer tick, rabies, non-human reservoir. So it could be another animal, or non-animal reservoirs would be things like for Legionella, it would be the cooling towers, cooling columns of AC systems. Contaminated water supplies would be another non-animal reservoir. So contaminated water supplies. Portals of exit and entry. How do they get into the human? Okay. Another, let's see, I got to give myself a little bit of room here. Let's get rid of this stuff over here. I'm going to make this red. Portals of entry and exit. Blue's not going to work. There we go. There we go. Oh, I still had it on the eraser. So portals of entry and exit. So there's the fecal oral route, for example. Something like poliovirus is contracted through the fecal oral route through contaminated water. Basically, poliovirus would exit the body through feces, and a little bit of that gets into lake water where everybody's swimming because you got your wet butt in the lake. For example, if somebody else is swimming there and accidentally swallows some, gets in there. That's the fecal oral route. Sexual route, so genitalia. For sexually transmitted diseases, how do they get in and out of the body? Go. All right. So we already talked about reservoirs of infection, human versus non-human. Yes. Symptomatic and asymptomatic carriers. We've been talking about this a lot with coronavirus. You probably read a bunch of this stuff or heard about it outside of the classroom. But a carrier, someone with symptoms, we know to avoid them, right? You get symptoms of coronavirus, you're going to know to quarantine yourself. Asymptomatic carriers are a huge problem because there appears to be a lot of transmission of COVID through asymptomatic carriers. People who think they're fine, who are like, I had a test 2 weeks ago and it was negative. Well, they may have caught it in the interim, are not showing symptoms, go to Thanksgiving dinner and gets everybody infected, or goes to a party, or eats indoors at a restaurant, has their mask on there, and because of the airflow inside the building, managed to infect somebody else. So asymptomatic carriers are a huge concern with a lot of diseases, especially ones that are airborne or through droplets. So let's talk about transmission. Transmission is how diseases travel from one person to another. Now, there is direct transmission. You know what? This is not gonna fit on this little screenshot here. I think what I ought to do is go back to Notability. Yeah, here we go. So transmission. Transmission of communicable diseases. You can have direct transmission. So direct transmission would be, person to person, so touch, kissing, sexual contact, kissing, coughing directly right on a person. Indirect, this would be where someone, has some sort of infection and they cough into their hand and then they go and open a doorknob. And then 20 minutes later, you come by and you touch that doorknob. That's indirect. So not immediately. You don't have to see and touch, or you don't have to be in close contact with a person to catch something through indirect. All right, so how does indirect occur? It occurs through contaminated objects, which we call fomites. So you need to know that term, fomite. Indirect. So contaminated objects, fomites don't appear to be driving the COVID pandemic. In the beginning of the pandemic, we were concerned. We didn't know if it could be transmitted through easily or even primarily through fomites. Now, I'm not saying that it's not ever transmitted through fomites, because it very well could be, but we're not seeing that. We're not seeing transmission through fomites. So in the beginning, that's why we were telling people to not touch your mail for several hours, to wipe off all of your groceries with bleach wipes and Lysol wipes and everything like that. Fauci says he is not doing that anymore. I'm not. However, I will add that a lot of rhinoviruses, which cause the common cold and influenza, actually do appear to be transmitted through fomites. You can still get sick if you're not wiping things off and people aren't washing their hands a whole lot. So fomite transmission is more common through common cold viruses, but not for coronavirus. Okay, and it is indirect contact. Another form of indirect contact is airborne transmission, which you've probably heard a good bit about if you follow the news much. Airborne transmission, I think I need to put an E on the end of that. This is when when the pathogen can be carried on tiny droplets in the air. And when there's an emphasis on the word tiny droplets in the air, because when it's tiny droplets, aerosols can travel 10 to 20 meters very easily. So they can travel very far. Much farther than large droplets. So large droplets, I'm going to put direct transmission over here. Okay, sexual contact, kissing, coughing on a person. Coughing on a person is an example of droplet transmission. Droplet transmission. So again, the difference between droplet and airborne is the size of the droplets. Larger droplets, water droplets that is, than airborne. So they don't travel as far. Larger droplets do not travel as far as tiny droplets. It has been aerosolized or airborne. Airborne is, think We know that droplet transmission and other forms of direct transmission, such as kissing, if you're sharing saliva with somebody, you're going to be sharing air. It's the air you share, right? But coronavirus, COVID seems to be following a droplet transmission. There is some evidence of airborne, but we're not seeing a lot of strength in that. That's why we're wearing masks, and why we also say you can stay 6 feet apart. With aerosols, you got to stay farther apart than that. So actually, there's some epidemiologists that are like, you better be 20 feet away from any other person. But we don't seem to be seeing aerosols as driving that. So that's good, because if it were airborne, if it were in an aerosol, we're screwed. Because then it can travel so much farther if there's an infected person nearby. All right, there is another form of transmission in indirect. I should go back to red here. Indirect, I'd categorize this under indirect. Let's put it down here. Put number 3, and that is through vectors. A vector is something that carries something from one person to another, either person or animal. Oh, here, I'll draw a sheep again. Not just sheep, any animal, okay? It from one organism to another. Let's just do that. One organism to another. So we used the term vector in the past to mean like a viral vector that can carry, like, let's say if we're talking about transduction, which is the sharing of genetic material between 2 different microbial cells via a virus. Remember that? Transduction. The virus is a vector that carries DNA from one cell to another. But in this case, a vector would be an animal, such as, deer ticks. Deer ticks carry that little spirochete from the deer to you, or from one person to the deer to another, right? Rabies as well. Apple Pencil, battery's low. I better talk fast, y'all. Let's see. So a vector would be an animal. An animal, mosquito, a rabid dog. If the dog is bit by a rabid raccoon and the dog bites you, the dog serves as a vector. An animal that carries a pathogen from one person to another. Yeah. All right. This is also, when you have an animal vector, this is also known as a zoonotic disease. If there is an animal reservoir and then an animal vector that brings it from the animal to you, it's called a zoonotic disease. Okay, so talking about, we get through that. We talked about zoonotic diseases, asymptomatic carriers, airborne. Oh, yeah. Also, transmission through food and water. Yeah, you can get food poisoning. It's transmitted through the food. Water is definitely a means. Contaminated water is definitely a means of transmission. So we got vectors, zoonotic diseases. So, okay, when you do an epidemiological study, and this is all stuff from the very beginning of the course too, they do a lot of personal interviews to figure out how things are being transmitted, and this totally happened in the beginning of the pandemic as well. They wanted to look at who was getting it. Did their gender make a difference? Did their age make a difference? their general health, are only people, who have a particular, who have high blood pressure getting this? What are their personal habits? Where did they go? Where did they pick this up from? So they're the who, what, when, where, how, and why people. And so they do that through personal interview. We try to look at the geography of things. This is all stuff that we have chit-chat about before. Just to show a little bit of hierarchy for how this works. All right, this is kind of a top-down thing. The World Health Organization, well, actually, let's start at the bottom of this. First up, any sort of new disease or something that appears to be communicable is going to be reported to your local departments of public health at the state and local level. They will then report to the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Infectious Diseases, the National Institute for the Study of Infectious Diseases as well. That's who Fauci actually works for. They answer to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and then we all answer to the World Health Organization. The current president ended the U.S.'s relationship with the World Health Organization, and our president-elect has said that it will be reestablished, and that is good news for public health in this country. We really need to be working with the World Health Organization for things like vaccine distribution. We have to work together as a world. Otherwise, somebody's going to be left out, and it could very well be you. And we don't want that to happen. We want everybody to have access to the vaccine, and we want the most vulnerable people to be vaccinated first. There is one more thing that I just wanted to chit-chat about, and that's nosocomial infections. A nosocomial infection is one that you acquire in the hospital. Now, you could catch it from a healthcare worker, or you could catch it from another patient, but this last one here is just trying to do a screenshot here. Okay, you can actually catch an infection in the hospital from your own flora. So a nosocomial infection, hospital-acquired infection, C. diff is usually an example of that. We treat people, if someone goes in for surgery, we give them antibiotics, usually via an IV when they go home. Oops, what happened here? There we go, things got off kilter. But your own flora, there are some procedures where you could possibly get an infection from your own flora for something that should never happen. So, for example, a prostate biopsy. Okay, a lot of men tend to get prostate infections as they get older or have an enlarged prostate. And what they do is they do a test, like a blood test to keep an eye on you, and they look at your PSA levels. And if you have a high PSA test, they will go in and do a prostate biopsy to make sure that you don't have prostate cancer, because that is a really serious cancer, and it's very difficult it's not an easy surgery. It's not an easy one to remove. But to do a prostate biopsy, you have to basically put a probe up and access the prostate through the anus and through the colon. So you have to go up through the anus and then go into the prostate from there. Well, you all know that your colon is filled with enteric bacteria, lots of them. And so that biopsy needle can carry microbes from the gut into the prostate. It's fine if those microbes are in the gut. That's where they live. That's their home. That's where they do their job. But they're not supposed to be in the prostate, and they can cause a really bad prostate infection. I know this because this happened to my dad. It is a nosocomial infection. It happened to my dad. He was extremely sick. I can't tell you how sick he was. And he managed to pull through, and we're very lucky because we weren't so sure that he would. But that was a nosocomial infection. Got to be really careful of that. Only do prostate biopsies if you're absolutely sure you need to have one. That's why physicians don't do those all the time. Okay, that is the last part of the PowerPoint. So bye-bye, PowerPoint. Let's come back here because I just want to chit-chat a little bit about just finish off the course by talking about another disorder. Okay, we've talked a lot about COVID as it emerges, and there will probably continue to be a lot more information, but I just briefly wanted to talk about HIV. HIV basically became an epidemic around, it reached, or rather, how do I want to say this? HIV, it turns out, has been endemic since the 20s. There is evidence of that. We didn't know it at the time, but HIV, the HIV pandemic and the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome that it causes did not really become prevalent in the Western world, in the US, until around 1981. That's when the HIV epidemic, officially began, and the Center for Disease Control recognized it. CDC recognizes AIDS as an epidemic. And we didn't know what caused it yet. We looked for reservoirs of infection. Transmission is obviously through sexual contact. But because there was so much mystery surrounding it, a lot of stigmas began to develop around the disease. Most of you are probably too young to remember how, because it emerged in a gay male population in San Francisco and New York, it was labeled the gay disease. I mean, I think it was actually called, what was it? Something like gay-related immunodeficiency. Like, people who are gay, their bodies don't work differently than other bodies. It was ridiculous to call it a gay disease. But because it is transmitted through sexual contact, that people who had a lot of sexual partners, it would emerge that way. We've also found that it's through blood contact as well. So a lot of people who receive blood transfusions could contract an HIV infection that way, and also through, and this is related to blood contact, through shared needles, so IV drug use. Drug use and shared needles. I mean, anytime you get a shot with a needle, it's going to be a sterile needle, but a lot of IV drug users would reuse the needles and share them. And so there was a lot of stigma surrounded the HIV epidemic because it was transmitted through IV drug use and sexual contact. It wasn't until, I think it was something like 1985 that the human immunodeficiency virus was actually identified as a virus, and learning about identified and isolated. That's causing that. So that's 4 years. That is a long time. I mean, with coronavirus, we were able to figure it out and get its genome sequenced right away because this is 2020. And back in 1981, we didn't have all of those tools. So it took quite some time to identify the virus. Epidemiologists worked hard and, again, identified blood contact, sexual contact as the means of transmission. And again, because of that, and because it was found in a gay male population, I mean, come on, we all know no one can not have safe sex, unless you're with one partner. You need to know your partner, right? So anybody, but still the stigma took quite a while to be erased. And, in 1981, Ronald Reagan was president. He never spoke of AIDS publicly until 1985. So meanwhile, in the ensuing years from 81 to 85, and we knew that it was transmitted through sexual contact, we were trying to come up with policies telling people, you need to you need to have safe sex and what safe sex entails. IV drug use. We now have needle distribution programs, right? So to discourage the use of shared needles. So we had needle exchange programs, blood contact, care that has to be taken with screening blood samples. But it was 4 years, and that's 4 years of lost policy. So it was 1985 until Reagan even publicly mentioned the AIDS epidemic. And in fact, Reagan had a Surgeon General of C. Everett Koop. Oh, sorry, that was with a K. I think is it with a K or with a C? It's a K. Koop. And if you Google this guy, I'm pretty sure he was the guy who had this big Santa Claus beard, and he was a hoot. Reagan forbid Everett Koop from speaking out about the AIDS epidemic. And the thing is, he was Surgeon General. Does this sound familiar? Does it? It's familiar. So finally, it was 1986 when President Reagan finally gave the go-ahead to his Surgeon General, C. Everett Koop, to go ahead and issue a report about AIDS and tell the American public all about this. And Reagan put Everett Koop under a lot of pressure to just, keep in line with my policies and, be really conservative about this, and don't be talking about having safe sex because my constituents don't want to have talk of condoms and the like. And we don't want to be talking about people who are gay, and we don't want to talk about how it's not a gay disease, and blah, 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 blah. C. Everett Koop did not care. Instead, his report went into detail about how we have to have safe sex, how we should have we need to talk about this in schools, how we should have condom distribution programs and needle exchange programs, and it was not popular with Reagan. So I don't know if Koop lost his job over this. I'm going to have to look it up. But he actually, and I remember this because it was late 80s, he actually sent out mailers to every U.S. citizen with scientific info about the AIDS epidemic. So I'm pointing this out, not to bring politics into this, but to say it's really difficult to separate politics from the science of virology, of public health, and the science of epidemiology. It's always been mixed up with this, and this is pretty much where we are today, isn't it? Again, does this all sound familiar? It should, because people play politics, and when you're a scientist, you just want to do what you can to keep people healthy and to keep the population healthy, but it can be difficult to do that when politics has colored this. Again, I am a scientist, so I'm always going to be looking at the science. I'm not a politician, but it does color things. But when we go back to the science and trust the science, it informs our policies in ways that benefit everybody. Final example, there was a kid named Ryan White. I think it was 1984. Ryan White was a young boy, and I want to say he was 10 years old when he was diagnosed with an HIV infection and AIDS. He had hemophilia, and he had contracted the virus through a blood transfusion. When you're a hemophiliac, you used to have blood transfusions. Maybe you still do. I need to look that up. But his local public middle school did not want to allow him to enroll as a student because he had AIDS, and they were afraid that it was going to be communicated through other means, even though epidemiologists, and it was well studied that it was only through much more intimate contact. It was not contracted through casual contact. We did know that at the time. We were able to remove the stigma of AIDS and HIV infections, whether you contracted it through sexual contact or blood contact or IV drug use, able to remove that stigma through science. I think this case actually went to the Supreme Court. I'm not sure. Maybe it went to his state Supreme Court. I can't even remember what state he was from, but he finally gave up the fight and decided to go to a different middle school that had contacted he and his family and said, we would be happy to welcome you here. We know that HIV infections are not contracted through casual contact. So I wanted to leave that there and say, people who contract various diseases in an epidemic or a pandemic or just something that is endemic can at least fall back to science and point to that when their political and civil rights are threatened. So science informing politics rather than the other way around is what public health officials prefer. And I hope you have enjoyed this course. I hope you have learned a whole lot about not only epidemiology, but also about how the viruses and bacteria that cause these epidemics and pandemics are structured and how they work, and that you too can use science to inform your personal decisions as well. Thank you and good night.